Robert Brym actually was on another study where it was found that only 51% of Canadian Jews self-identify as Zionist. There was just a poll now in the UK. We don't have that many numbers, but in the UK, 26%, I think, of 20-year-old Jews identify as anti-Zionist. For sure, we're not the majority, but it's a growing community, and there are various shades.
That's a bit of what it sounded like last month in Ottawa at a Senate committee studying antisemitism. On November 3rd, the senators were discussing research by U of T sociology professor Robert Brym about Canadian Jews. Last year, Brym had been commissioned to do a study on behalf of 3 progressive Jewish organizations, J-Space Canada, New Israel Fund of Canada, and Canadian Friends of Peace Now. Nearly 600 Canadian Jews were surveyed in the summer of 2024, right before the one-year anniversary of the October 7th attacks. And indeed, as the witness from Independent Jewish Voices testified in those Senate hearings that afternoon, Brym's survey found barely over half of Canadian Jews, or 51%, reported that they call themselves Zionists. His survey also found that 94% of Canadian Jews say they support Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. And nearly that many had a strong or somewhat strong emotional attachment to Israel. So how could both be true? A few weeks ago, at that Senate hearing, IJV officials said the survey proves more and more Jews are feeling anti-Zionist, a growing community, they said. And when Robert Brym heard what happened at the Senate hearings, he was very upset. He says anti-Israel activists and others have been deliberately weaponizing his findings and creating misleading impressions to bolster their campaigns. He conducted a second survey a few months after the first one because he wanted to try to make sense of the dichotomy, but he wasn't able to speak out publicly about what he's found until his latest academic paper was officially published just now in the Canadian Jewish Studies Journal. Brym found the percentage of Canadian Jews who do not support the existence of Israel as a state is still minuscule, 1% of the population. But the people who say they don't like the Zionist label is much larger. He found there are at least 3 reasons why half of Canadian Jews don't call themselves Zionists out loud, but likely are.
The meaning of Zionism has changed over time. It's now a negative for many, many people. Jews don't want to be part of the negative. They don't want to call themselves Zionists. But they are Zionists by the dictionary or encyclopedia definition of the term, as I say.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Friday, December 18th, 2025. Welcome to North Star, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, made possible thanks to the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Sociologist Robert Brym says after his first study came out with the seemingly contradictory findings about Jews and Zionism, he decided he had to do a deeper dive. So he went back on his own dime. No one asked him to do it. And he surveyed the same 600 Jewish people who'd answered him the first time. He found at least 3 explanations. The overwhelming majority of Canada's Jews support Israel as a Jewish state. The meaning of the word Zionist has changed over decades, especially since October 7th. He calls it a semantic shift to a very negative meaning. Also, he said, identifying as a Zionist now makes trouble for Jews in their schools, their offices, and in social settings. And also, Canadian Jews themselves, especially younger Jews under 25, are being bombarded with news reports and social media that says Zionism and Zionists are bad. Brym, who calls himself a Zionist, says he's not optimistic the word can be rehabilitated in the near future. He joins me today from Toronto with a prescription for what Jews or others who support Israel should tell people. Good to have you back.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Ellen.
Well, I'm inviting you because your earlier survey received a lot of coverage about how Canadian Jews feel about Zionism and the connection to the state of Israel. We're a year later, we have you back because it was sticking in your craw. You wanted to do more. It was bothering you as professional demographer and sociologist.
In the 2024 survey, I wasn't not surprised to discover that 94% of Canadian Jews think that Israel should exist as a Jewish state. I expected a large percentage. This was actually a little larger than I expected. But I was surprised that at the same time, 49% of the sample of nearly 600 Jews said that they do not think of themselves as a Zionist. And that was startling. I didn't know at the time that this question had been asked in 3 surveys in the US, in Chicago, Los Angeles, and in Portland, Oregon, between 2020 and 2023. And the percentage of Jews who didn't want to call themselves Zionists was even higher in those cities. But to me, it was a paradox, a contradiction. I always thought that Zionism as being, well, by the dictionary definition, support for the existence of a Jewish state in Israel. And here, people were saying that they're not Zionists, but they believed in the existence of the Jewish state. So I needed intellectually somehow to reconcile this apparent contradiction. And I did so by asking the original 588 respondents if they would be prepared to answer a few additional questions. This was 6 months after the first survey. Asking the 588 respondents if they would be able to answer a few additional questions on what they understood by the term Zionism and how they felt now, 5 months later. And that led me to believe that the main reason that people were saying, that 49% of people were saying that they're not prepared to call themselves Zionist, is because the meaning of the word Zionism has changed over time. It's become, among a very wide circle of people, including Jews, a pejorative term. That's because they're in circles and in institutions and organizations and on the street where they hear people saying that Zionism is racism, that Israel's a genocide state, and on and on and on. They've confronted outright anti-Semitism that has nothing to do with Israel. But they've also felt there's a lot of negativism out there about Israel. And therefore, they don't want to be identified with that negativism. It doesn't mean they don't support the existence of a Jewish state. It means they just don't want to be called Zionist.
You have a term for it. You call it semantic drift. Is that is that actually a scientific term or something you created?
It's a term in linguistics. It's called semantic change or semantic drift, that over time, if people start using a word in a different way than it was used originally, the meaning gradually shifts. The example that I give is the word silly, which in Old English used to mean touched by God. And by the late 15th century meant, ridiculous or foolish. The meaning changed over time. And the meaning of Zionism, even for some Jews, has changed over time. And that's what they're reacting to when they hear the word Zionism, for the most part. That said, there are some anti-Zionist Jews, clearly. I was able to figure out from the responses that they amount to 1% of the Canadian Jewish population. Now, 1% is a very small number. And unfortunately, when the first survey came out, people who are anti-Zionists in Canada, Jews, started saying, 49% of Jews in Canada are not Zionists. And that is a tremendous oversimplification of what I found, which is that 49% of Jews don't want to call themselves Zionists because they don't like the word Zionist, because it has negative connotation. But they're Zionist insofar as they support the existence of a Jewish state. And that was not clarified by certain people on the far left of the Jewish community who are anti-Zionist.
So are you saying, if I understood, that it was weaponized and misreported or misunderstood, or maybe both?
It wasn't misunderstood. People read into what I write and what others write, whatever they want to hear. I mean, I find it's like a Rorschach test, I publish stuff and, an individual on the right says, I like this and I like that. And somebody on the left says, I like that and I don't like this. You know what I mean? They pick and choose the findings they like, and they interpret them in the way that suits their pre-existing values.
The danger, though, maybe, and I'm saying this, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but as an academic, I'm not sure if you're aware that study and that figure that came out first is being used even now in testimony to the Senate of Canada about anti-Semitism. For example, in the briefs by Independent Jewish Voices or CAPE for Palestine, which is a large public service union, they are literally using that figure of yours to say, you see,
Yeah.
and it's being weaponized in a way. And I'm using that word. Do you agree that that's how it, and how do you feel about that in terms of your own personal responsibility about this to that's why you're doing this survey number 2?
I feel awful about this. I think it's wrong. And in fact, I wrote to the members of that Senate committee, pending a copy of my report and explaining why the position of Independent Jewish Voices and other similar organizations is simply wrong. They've misinterpreted the meaning of the survey intentionally or because it fits their pre-existing values. I don't know their motivation exactly. I can surmise, but I don't want to. What I know is they're wrong. And I told the members of the committee that, and I'm waiting to hear a response from them.
So how much damage do you think the first report has done to Zionism in Canada? And then how do you hope this study, you call it wave 2, study number 2, seems to sort of damage control or mitigate that a bit? Or is that not what you wanted to do? Sorry, I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I wanted to, first of all, figure this out intellectually, what's going on. As I mentioned at the outset, that was my original motivation for doing the second study, wave 2. But yes, I very much wanted to correct the error, and I hope that the committee will listen to what I wrote. I'm also, on Monday, actually, preparing an editorial for a major Canadian newspaper on this subject. I hope that will help to correct the error. And then there's this research report itself in Canadian Jewish Studies, which is being widely circulated, and I hope that'll have some effect. Of course, I have a responsibility. I'm a good Zionist.
I was going to ask you, how do you fit into this? You did this study first for 3 progressive Jewish organizations.
Yes.
You're still involved with NIFCAN, or no?
I'm still involved with New Israel Fund Canada.
Right.
Yes. I'm on the advisory board.
Okay, and so let's unpack some of what you found. This semantic drift. Some people would even call it word policing. I've heard a politician, Julie Dabruzin, at the Haaretz conference say when she makes a speech or something, she gets the letters, they're word policing every single thing she says. Is sort of that part of what you would call semantic drift or semantic change?
Yeah, but I mean, semantic drift is something internalized. People don't necessarily realize that they're policing themselves after a while. It becomes uncomfortable to call oneself a Zionist in certain milieu. And as a result, people get used to the idea of not calling themselves Zionist. I have no problem with it. I mean, I've been a Zionist since you joined Young Judea at 7 years old. But maybe not the kind of Zionist that you or others might imagine. I mean, I'm very critical of the Israeli government and many of its policies. And I feel as a Zionist, I'm perfectly entitled to be critical. But I support the existence of a Jewish state, very strongly so.
Ever since October 7th, 2023, Muslim and Jewish communities in Canada have been torn apart.
I've known you for 20 years. You've been at my house for Shabbat supper, I don't know how many times. And for 1 second, you can't put down your friend and just hold my hand?
We're fed a constant stream of Jews and Muslims talking at each other, about each other, but rarely do we hear them talking to each other.
Why are you doing this? What's the benefit of doing this?
This podcast aims to do something different. I'm Avi Feingold, a rabbi and a writer with the Canadian Jewish News.
I'm Yafa Sakeja, a Canadian-Palestinian entrepreneur and volunteer with the Canadian Friends of Standing Together.
We're sitting down with Jews and Muslims, Israelis and Palestinians from coast to coast and across the political divide, having difficult conversations in good faith.
We are not the Israeli government. Palestinians are not Hamas.
This is the place where we're both supposed to end up, Israeli and Palestinian, Arab and Jewish.
Subscribe to In Good Faith, wherever you listen to podcasts.
So personally, before we get into some specifics on the study, I'm curious how you've lived through this past, you said, few months, year, where you saw your study launch and then saw what happened to it. And then now, how did this journey feel for you?
Well, when I first heard them publicizing improperly what I had done, obviously I felt bad about it But, academic publishing is something, it's not a newspaper. It takes months before a paper gets published. It has to be reviewed by anonymous reviewers. Revisions have to be made. There's a whole process that takes months and months. So I knew that it was going to be delayed, and I didn't want to speak out loudly like I am now until it was actually published. So I could say, look, there was a peer-reviewed publication on a social scientific survey which refutes your arguments. Now I can say that. I couldn't before 2 days ago because it was just published 3 days ago. It has not been pleasant. It's not the first time that work that I've done has been misinterpreted or purposely or otherwise. All I can do is try to correct that in as articulate and loud a voice as I can when it happens. It's too bad that it took, the Senate hearing, for example, was in November. Now it's December. I wish I could have done something immediately, or even before the Senate hearing, or at the Senate hearing, to which I was not invited, however. This is second best, and I hope it'll have the desired effect.
When you say they misinterpreted, who is they?
Independent Jewish Voices is the main one. That's the one I listened to when I looked at a recording of the Senate.
No, I was referring to the people who commissioned the original study. Do you fault them for any of this?
No, I don't. New Israel Fund Canada and JSpace Canada commissioned the original study, and I do not fault them. They wanted to know legitimately how many Jews considered themselves to be Zionist. I thought it was a good question, an interesting question, and so we asked it. The finding was surprising. I wanted to go further and find out why people had answered the way they did. But there's nothing wrong with releasing this information. It's public information in the United States. As I mentioned, there are 3 studies that have been done that show even more. In Portland, Oregon, which is a left-wing city, it's well over 70% of the Jewish population won't say that they're Zionists. In Los Angeles and in Chicago, it's around 60%, which is higher than in Canada. It's a fact.
But they're Democrats, and that's a whole other issue. Let's talk about our Canadian environment. Is it a generational thing? In your survey, you talk about, they hear bad things about Israel, anti-Zionism on campus or on social media. Do you think that your data comes because younger people are feeling this way more than older people? How did it play out for your data?
I would have to do a deeper dive into the data in order to answer that question specifically the way you phrased it, and the numbers of respondents is not large enough to allow me to do that. When you start breaking it down, you get fewer and fewer individuals in each cell of a table, and the results become unreliable. What I can tell you is that for 2 years now, in half a dozen surveys, I've found that younger Jews are less pro-Israel than older Jews in Canada. However, it's not as bad as the United States. There's a much larger gap in the US than in Canada. So there is a gap, but it's more moderate than the US.
If people who support the existence of the state but don't want to be called Zionist because of things you just alluded to, why? Because it's not popular or scary or downright dangerous for them to do so where they work and live. Do we need another way to describe these people? And if so, how would you describe them?
If I were one of those people, I would say simply that I think that Israel has the right to exist as a Jewish state, and I don't want to label myself. You call that what you want. I support the existence of a Jewish state. And 94% of Canadian Jews, according to what I found, or a few percent less in another survey, but only a very few percent less, agree with that. If Zionism has become a pejorative term, then let's go easy on using it so much. Let's say we're pro the existence of a Jewish state in Israel. It amounts to the same thing. And unfortunately, we avoid the term. But fortunately, because it perhaps will be less antagonistic if we claim that.
Is it redeemable, do you think, in this generation to use that word? Or maybe we're done?
I think not in this generation. I don't know. I can't. My crystal ball, unfortunately, is broken today. But I don't expect that we're going to see much change. I know that the pejorative use of Zionism of the term Zionism has increased enormously, especially in the past couple of years. We've been able to track it. But even since the past 50 years, it's more and more become a pejorative term.
In your survey, you had sort of like a list of under what conditions would you then call yourself a Zionist. And you had a whole list of interesting, starting from the smallest to the most complicated. Even with, like Dayenu, even if Israel and the Hamas had a ceasefire, and even if they all the hostages came back, right? And even if there was a two-state solution, or even if there was a one-state solution with equal rights, would you? Now that there's a ceasefire and the hostages, except for one, as we're speaking, have been returned, do you think your survey answers might have been different?
To that question, I think so. I think they would have been somewhat different. But, you know, they were asked, how would you characterize Zionists? Some 70% of self-declared Zionists and 48% of self-declared non-Zionists share a liberal democratic definition of Zionism that embodies the principles in the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel that was published when the state was founded. Another 26% of Zionist Jews and 30% of non-Zionists offer a less democratic and more nationalistic definition of Zionism as a Jewish nationalist movement with the goal of creating and supporting a Jewish state in the ancestral homeland of the Jews.
All right, so that's important, because now, and so basically most people don't buy that, is what you're saying.
The second definition of the way people consider Zionism excludes the, equal rights part. It's a Jewish state and the Jewish state only. And in other words, there are no equal rights for non-Jews, is the implication of that second definition. 70% agreed with the original founding document of Israel. It's a Jewish state, but other people have equal rights, non-Jews. 26% said it's just a nationalist movement. It's supporting a Jewish state in the ancestral home of the Jews. But the more extreme right-wing definitions of Zionism did not ring true for most people.
I'm not surprised. So are you saying we need to just, in order to get over all this anxiety, you're not a psychologist, you're a social scientist,
yeah.
But maybe people need to stop using the word and they'll feel better and just say what you said.
I don't know. As you say, I'm not a psychologist, but I think what's interesting about what I'm suggesting is that it gives you a political opening. It allows you to say, look, if you don't recognize the need for a Jewish state, then you're suggesting that the state needs to be eliminated. And you may not recognize that you're saying that, but that's going too far. 85% of the countries in the United Nations, basically all those except the ones with an Arab majority or a Muslim majority, recognize the existence of a Jewish state. And that's been the case since 1948. And I think that it's important to be able to say that to people. I think it's also important, by the way, and I'm always emphasizing that it's important to recognize other people's suffering about their dispossession. And at the same time, I'm in favor of the existence of a Palestinian state, too, as a demilitarized neighbor of Israel. And I think it's important that people are able to say that and talk with empathy to Palestinians to reach some kind of a common ground. And I see that that's beginning to happen in universities and outside universities, that there are some people who are starting to form groups to talk across boundaries to each other. I think that's a very healthy development. We haven't done enough of that. We're very quick to criticize, to react negatively, and so on. And we should in many cases, but we should also be prepared to empathize.
Are you going to continue doing more with this to sort of understand the nuances, or are you doing another sort of general Canadian attitudes towards Jews type survey, which you've done before? What are you doing with this?
Well, I'm starting some new projects in the coming year. One of them, I hope to conduct an annual survey called the Canadian Jewish Barometer, which examines pressures on social, political, and economic pressures on the Jewish community and the Jewish community's responses to those pressures. So that, I hope, will be an annual survey, a large annual survey. And I'm doing a survey, and a set of interviews on anti-Semitism in Canadian trade unions. So that's that menu for 2026.
Thank you for clearing it up. We'll put the link, of course, and we'll be waiting to see your articles as well.
Thank you very much, Ellen.
And that's what it sounded like for this episode of North Star, made possible thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. To read the new survey paper, it's short, you can go to the link in our show notes. North Star is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman and Michael Freeman, the executive producer. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Do you call yourself a Zionist? Do you not? Tell me why. We're at info@thecjn.ca. And thanks for listening.